The sun beat down on the manicured lawn of the royal estate, turning the summer garden party into a shimmering tableau of wealth and effortless privilege. Laughter tinkled like crystal, the scent of roses and expensive perfume hung thick in the air. Prince George, just turned 9, stood stiffly in his miniature blazer, a dutiful smile plastered on his face as he accepted a posy from a beaming little girl. Behind him, Royal Guard Corporal Eris Thorne stood at parade rest, his eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, a statue of perfect discipline. In that split second, as the cameras flashed, Eris saw it, not in the prince, but in the reflection of a silver tea tray on a passing attendant's cart. A flicker of pure, unadulterated terror in the boy's eyes, directed not at the crowd, but at a figure standing calmly in the shade of a centuries-old oak. Then, the prince's knees buckled. The posy fell. A collective gasp sliced through the air. And, before anyone could move, Eris Thorne was on his knees, cradling the small, limp form of the future king. But it was the sound that ripped the perfect day to shreds, not a gasp, not a shout, but a raw, guttural scream tearing from the guard's own throat, a sound of such profound anguish and accusation that it froze the blood of every dignitary, every aide, every watching citizen. "She made me do this," he roared, his tear-streaked face turned not toward the panicking crowd, but toward that same shaded figure under the oak. In the echoing, horrified silence that followed, a single, devastating question hung over the crumbling fairy tale. Who was she? The pristine world of the Kensington Palace Gardens shattered into a kaleidoscope of panic. For Eris Thorne, time didn't slow, it fractured. One moment, he was a sentinel, a piece of the scenery. The next, his training evaporated, overridden by a primal instinct he didn't understand. He was on the ground, the rough grass biting through his uniform trousers, the weight of the young prince frighteningly light in his arms. George's face was pale, a stark contrast to the vibrant red of the discarded flowers. The boy's breath came in shallow, ragged pulls. "Medic!" Now, the command, sharp and authoritative, came from his own mouth, but it felt distant. His scream, that terrible, revealing scream, still echoed in his own skull. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, a physical pressure. The shaded figure under the oak, Lady Constance Havisham, the king's own cousin and George's newly appointed private tutor, hadn't moved. Her expression was one of concerned shock, perfectly manufactured. Chaos erupted. Security personnel swarmed, forming a human shield. Aides rushed forward, their faces masks of professional terror. The gentle hum of the party was replaced by shouted orders, the static crackle of radios, and the beginning of a low, collective murmur from the guests. Eris refused to relinquish his hold on George until the royal medical team physically pried his arms away. As they lifted the boy onto a stretcher, George's eyes fluttered open for a second, glazed, confused, and locking directly with Eris's. There was no recognition, only a depth of exhaustion that no child should ever possess. Hands gripped Eris's shoulders, pulling him roughly to his feet. It was his direct superior, Sergeant Major Briggs. "Thorne, my office." Now, Briggs's voice was low, a gravelly whisper of pure fury. The walk off the lawn, through the pristine corridors usually traversed with silent respect, felt like a perp walk. Whispers trailed in his wake. "Did you hear him? What did he mean? Is the prince all right?" Briggs's office was a Spartan, functional space. The door clicked shut, sealing them in a bubble of tense silence. "Explain," Briggs said, standing behind his desk, not offering a seat. Eris's mind raced. The words he'd screamed were a truth he hadn't even known he was carrying. "The prince collapsed, sir. I reacted." "Don't insult me," Briggs snapped. "You didn't react. You had a hysterical episode and made a public, accusatory scene." "Who is she?" The image of Lady Constance flashed in his mind, her cool composure at the window during George's late-night lessons, the way the prince would flinch when she entered a room, the strange, locked journal George had once desperately tried to hide during a security sweep. But it was all feeling, instinct. "No proof." "I don't know, sir. It was the stress of the moment, the sight of him falling. You're a trained professional, Thorne. You've served in active zones. You don't crack because a child faints." Briggs leaned forward, his palms flat on the desk. "The king and queen are in a helicopter returning from Norwich. The prince is en route to the London clinic. The press is already crafting headlines from cell phone videos. Your career, your pension, your freedom are hanging by a thread. The only thing that might save you is the truth. The real truth." Eris felt the walls closing in. To voice his suspicions about a member of the royal family, a woman placed in her position by the king himself, was career suicide. But the memory of George's terrified reflection in the tea tray was more compelling. He took a deep breath. It's about the prince, sir. His state of mind. For weeks now, he's been different. Withdrawn. Jumpy. And Lady Havisham is always there. Briggs's eyes narrowed. You are suggesting the king's cousin, a woman with an impeccable record, is harming the heir? Not physically, Eris said carefully. Psychologically. I think she's manipulating him. Isolating him. His old friends from school aren't allowed to visit. His playtime is strictly scheduled with educational purpose. He carries that journal everywhere, writes in it frantically. He looks like a prisoner. The sergeant major was silent for a long minute. You are suspended, effective immediately. You will surrender your credentials and your firearm. You will not leave the city. And you will speak of this to no one. An internal investigation will begin. If you are wrong, Thorne, you will spend the next decade in a military prison for slander and conduct unbecoming. If you are right, he didn't finish the thought. The implication was darker than any prison. Now get out. Stepping out of the palace gates as a civilian, stripped of his authority and purpose, Eris felt a new kind of exposure. The world outside was already buzzing with the news. Newspaper vans were clustering at the edges of the security cordon. His phone, now a personal device rather than a secured tool, began to vibrate with calls from numbers he didn't recognize. He ignored them. He had one objective now, a mission born not of duty, but of a bond he hadn't acknowledged. He had to find proof. And he knew where to start. The prince's private journal. It was the key. Getting to it, however, with the palace on lockdown and him branded a loose cannon, would be impossible. He needed an ally on the inside. His thoughts went to Alara Vance, the senior palace housemaid. She was discreet, observant, and, he remembered, she had once confided her unease about the new atmosphere in the prince's wing. The London clinic was a fortress of quiet luxury and heightened security. In a private suite, Queen Catherine sat by her son's bedside, her hand wrapped around his, her face a masterpiece of controlled maternal fear. The doctors had run tests, dehydration, low blood sugar, a simple faint brought on by the heat and excitement, they said. But the mother in her knew it was more. George slept, but it was a fitful sleep, punctuated by murmurs she couldn't quite decipher. King Charles stood by the window, his back to the room, staring out at the London skyline. The weight of the crown had never felt so physically heavy. The reports from Briggs were alarming. A guard, one of their most trusted, having a breakdown and accusing an unnamed she. The press was having a field day. Conspiracy in the palace. Heir targeted. The more salacious outlets were already digging into Lady Constance's past, a past he himself had helped sanitize. Charles, Catherine's voice was soft but firm. What aren't you telling me about Constance? He didn't turn. She is family. She is brilliant. George needs discipline, a firm intellectual hand. He needs to be a child, Catherine countered, her voice breaking. He jumps at shadows now. He recites historical treaties instead of asking for a story. This isn't discipline, it's conditioning. She took a deep breath. The guard. Thorne. What did he mean? The man is unstable. He cracked under pressure. Or he saw something we've been too busy to see. She looked at her son's pale face. I want a child psychologist brought in. Not one vetted by the court. An independent one. The king finally turned, his expression pained. The optics. I don't care about the optics. I care about our son. Her whisper was fierce. And I want to see his journal. The one he writes in constantly. A flicker of unease crossed the king's face. Catherine, a prince's private thoughts are not. Are not what? Evidence. She stood up, releasing George's hand. Something is wrong. That scream today, it wasn't the sound of a man cracking. It was the sound of a man breaking a seal on a terrible secret. Find out what Thorne knows. And keep Constance away from George until we do. Meanwhile, in a modest flat across the city, Eris Thorne was making his own moves. He'd managed to contact Alara Vance. Meeting in a crowded, noisy pub, he laid out his fears. Alara, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes, listened intently. The laundry, she said quietly, stirring her tea. He hides it in his mattress. But the linens are changed Tuesdays and Fridays. He forgets sometimes. I've seen it. A small, leather-bound book. She looked at Eris. He's a sweet boy. Was. Since she arrived, the light's gone out. The other staff talk. They hear her at night, in his room, talking in that low, steady voice. Not reading stories. More like giving instructions. Can you get it? The journal? Eris asked, his heart pounding. Tomorrow is Friday, she said, her face set with resolve. I'll be in his room by 10. If it's there, I'll get it to you. But if I'm caught, you won't be, Eris said, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. The plan was set. The journal would either vindicate him or destroy them both. Back at the palace, in her elegant suite, Lady Constance Havisham was not panicking. She stood before a mirror, calmly brushing her long, dark hair. The incident was unfortunate, a variable she hadn't accounted for, the emotional fragility of a common soldier. But it was also an opportunity. The prince's collapse was a tangible result, a proof of concept. The conditioning was taking root, the pressure she was applying to his young mind creating the desired fractures. The guard's outburst had thrown a spotlight, but it was a chaotic, unreliable light. She knew how institutions worked. They would close ranks, protect their own. The guard would be discredited, labeled unstable. And she, the picture of aristocratic poise, would remain above the fray, the concerned tutor, the steadying hand in the crisis. She allowed herself a small, cold smile. The project was proceeding. The future king was being shaped, his will tempered in the fire of controlled trauma. The scream of a guard was merely noise. Soon, it would be forgotten. The real work was just beginning. The Friday morning sun did little to warm the chill in Eris Thorne's flat. He paced, his civilian clothes feeling like a costume. Every tick of the clock echoed Alara's risk. At 10:15, his phone, a cheap burner he'd purchased, buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Green Park. Bench by the statue. 30 minutes. It's hot. He was there in 20. The park was bustling with tourists and nannies, a scene of normalcy that felt alien. Alara arrived, looking like any other shopper with a reusable bag. She sat beside him, not looking at him, and placed the bag between them. It was there, she murmured, her lips barely moving. Under the mattress, just like he said. I've never done anything like this in my 40 years of service. Her hands trembled slightly. You did the right thing, Eris said, his hand closing around the bag. He felt the rectangular outline of a small book inside. Thank you, Alara. Now go, and act normally. You were never here. She stood and melted into the crowd without another word. Eris waited a few minutes, then walked briskly to a secluded area behind some thick hedges. His fingers trembled as he opened the bag and pulled out the journal. It was indeed a simple leather-bound book, the kind a schoolboy might use. He opened it to a random page. The handwriting was George's, but it was erratic, sometimes neat and loopy, other times a frantic, pressured scrawl. The entries were not a boy's diary. There were no mentions of friends, toys, or adventures. Instead, page after page was filled with repetitive phrases, copied historical decrees of absolute obedience, and strange, chilling sentences that looked like they had been written to dictation. A mind must be clear of clutter to bear the crown. Clutter is emotion. Clutter is attachment. I must be clear. And again, duty is the only love. The nation is the only family. She shows me the way. Her voice is the compass. Then, Eris found the more recent entries. They were different, more fragmented, more personal, and infinitely more disturbing. Today I cried because Nanny Ellie brought the wrong biscuits. She said tears are a leak of resolve. I had to write, I am not a vessel for sentiment 100 times. My hand hurts. I dreamed of Grandpa. I called for him. She was angry. She said the past is a ghost that weakens the future. I must not summon ghosts. I had to sit in the dark and repeat, I am alone. I am strong. I wasn't strong. I was scared. Mummy hugged me too long after the photo call. She smelled like flowers. It felt nice. Later, she said maternal affection is a sweet poison that dilutes purpose. I must learn to take it as medicine, in small doses, not crave it. I don't want to be poisoned. But I miss the smell of flowers. The final entry, dated the day before the garden party, made Eris's blood run cold. It was a single, shaky line, the ink smudged as if by a tear or a sweaty finger. She says I have to prove my loyalty. A public test. I don't want to. But a king obeys. I am so tired. This was not education. This was psychological torture. Systematic emotional dismantling. He had his proof, but it was a radioactive object. He couldn't go to the press. It would be a betrayal of the prince's privacy and national security. He couldn't go back to Briggs without a concrete plan. He needed someone with unassailable authority and a motive to protect George. The Queen. He remembered the look on her face at public events, the subtle way she'd sometimes watch Constance, a flicker of a mother's unease. She was his only chance. Meanwhile, In the king's private study at Clarence House, Charles was facing his own reckoning. The head of royal protection was presenting a preliminary report. Corporal Thorne's service record is spotless, sir. Decorated. Not a hint of instability. His colleagues describe him as reserved, but fiercely dedicated. His outburst was entirely out of character. And, Lady Havisham? The king asked, his voice weary. The security chief shifted uncomfortably. Her background check, the one done before her appointment, was thorough. But we've initiated a deeper dive. There are gaps. A year spent abroad after university, vaguely accounted for. Associations with certain academic groups that lean toward radical traditionalist philosophies. Not illegal, but concerning. Her former husband, from whom she is divorced, refused to speak to our investigators. He hung up. A seed of doubt, long suppressed, began to sprout in the king's mind. He had brought Constance in at the urging of his late father's old advisors, men who believed the modern monarchy was too soft, that the future king needed to be forged of sterner stuff. He had seen her intellect, her poise, and had ignored the coldness in her eyes, dismissing it as aristocratic reserve. Now, looking at his son lying in a hospital bed, he wondered if he had let a wolf into the nursery. At the same time, Queen Catherine was conducting her own investigation. Using a private, encrypted line, she spoke to a renowned child trauma specialist, Dr. Anya Sharma, describing George's symptoms without naming him. Dr. Sharma's diagnosis was immediate and firm. What you're describing sounds like a child under sustained coercive control, likely experiencing a form of emotional abuse designed to create dependency and break down autonomous thought. The fainting could be a physical manifestation of extreme psychological stress. Catherine ended the call, her heart a block of ice. She knew. She just knew. She stormed into her husband's study, bypassing protocol. Charles, we need to remove Constance. Now. Today. Before he could answer, his private secretary entered, pale. Sir, ma'am, we have a situation. Corporal Thorne, the suspended guard, has bypassed palace security. He's not here, but he sent a package. Addressed to Her Majesty. Marked urgent and confidential. It was delivered by a motorcycle courier to the back gates. He placed a padded envelope on the desk. Catherine didn't hesitate. She tore it open. Out slid the leather journal. She opened it, her eyes scanning the pages. As she read, her composure crumbled. A hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. She looked at her husband, her eyes blazing with a fury born of love. Read it, she whispered, her voice trembling. Read what she's been doing to our boy. The king took the journal. As he read, his face hardened into a mask of regal fury, the kind that had toppled governments in centuries past. The proof was in his hands, in his son's tortured script. At that very moment, Lady Constance was being informed by a loyal aide within the household that the journal was missing. She didn't panic. She calculated. The guard had it. The guard would take it to the queen. The emotional mother would react rashly. This was the crisis point, the moment where the project would either be terminated or could be accelerated. She picked up her phone and made a call. The contingency plan, she said calmly. Initiate Phase B. It's time to bring the prince to a place of clarity. She then packed a small suitcase. The palace was no longer safe for her, but she wasn't finished. Not yet. If she couldn't shape the air within the gilded cage, she would find another way to influence the throne. But first, she needed leverage. And she knew exactly where to find it. The discovery of George's journal acted like a detonator in the heart of the monarchy. King Charles, his face ashen with a fury that transcended anger, immediately issued two silent orders. First, to locate and detain Lady Constance Havisham for questioning. Second, to bring Corporal Heiress Thorne in from the cold, not as a suspect, but as a material witness. But Constance was gone. Her suite was empty, personal effects left in disarray, a deliberate performance of a hurried escape. Her electronic devices were wiped clean. The palace, a building designed for supreme control, had sprung a leak. The king's trust in his own household shattered. He stood with the queen in their private sitting room, the journal lying between them like an indictment. She spoke of Phase B, Catherine said, her voice raw. What does that mean? What is she going to do? We find her before we find out, Charles said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned to his most trusted protection officer. Thorne, where is he? Heiress was, at that moment, being escorted through a secret underground entrance to Buckingham Palace, a route used for the most discreet of movements. He was brought not to a Stark office, but to a quiet, wood-paneled anteroom. The queen entered alone. She looked at him, This man who had screamed her nightmare into existence. And, for a moment, there was no sovereign and subject, only two people united by fear for a child. "Thank you," she said simply, her regal composure softened by profound gratitude. "You saw what we refused to see." "How is he, ma'am?" Eris asked, the formal address feeling strange now. "Sleeping. Sedated for his own protection. The doctors say his stress hormone levels are those of a soldier in combat." She closed her eyes briefly. "The journal, it confirms everything. But she's vanished. And she mentioned a phase B. We believe you are at risk. She will see you as the catalyst for her exposure." Before Eris could respond, the king entered. The dynamic shifted. This was the commander-in-chief assessing a soldier. "Corporal Thorne, your actions were irregular, but your instincts were correct. We need your perspective. What is her endgame? This conditioning. What is the objective?" Eris thought of the journal's phrases. "It's not just to make him obedient, sir. It's to remake him. To strip away his connections. To you, to her majesty, to his own childhood. And replace them with a single, guiding voice. Hers. She's not just a tutor. She's trying to become the architect of the future king's mind. Phase B, if she can't continue inside, she might try to get him outside." A cold dread settled over the room. The unthinkable, a kidnapping of the heir, was now on the table. Meanwhile, in a safe house flat in a nondescript part of London, paid for by untraceable funds, Constance Havisham watched the news coverage. The narrative was shifting. The initial guard's breakdown story was being supplemented by leaks about an internal palace investigation and concerns over the prince's welfare. The tide was turning against her. It was time to change the battlefield. Her plan was audacious. She didn't need to physically take the boy. Not yet. She needed to create a scenario where his loyalty to her programming would be tested publicly, proving her influence and undermining the parent's authority. She had resources, sympathizers in high places who shared her disdain for the soft, modern monarchy, individuals who believed a stronger, more detached king was needed for the turbulent times ahead. Using an encrypted messaging app, she sent a file to a clandestine email address used by a fringe, but influential, right-wing commentator known for his monarchist zeal. The file contained carefully edited excerpts from George's journal, focusing on the lines about duty over family and clarity over clutter, spliced with anonymous quotes from a palace insider describing the Queen's smothering emotionality and the King's weak modernism. The narrative was crafted. Prince George was a profound, serious soul being held back by his parents' outdated sentimentality. His collapse was a cry for a more rigorous path to kingship. Back at the palace, the storm hit. The commentator published a blistering article online. The prince's plea, are the king and queen fit to prepare the heir? It included the journal excerpts. The palace press office was inundated. Constitutional crisis was whispered in the halls. The queen was devastated, not by the attack on her, but by the violation of her son's most private torment being used as a weapon. The king was incandescent with rage. Eris, now working informally with a hastily assembled, trusted security team, saw the move for what it was, a diversion. "She's drawing our fire," he told the king and queen, "making us look defensive, secretive. While we're putting out this media fire, she's free to act. We need to find her network. Who helped her? Who believes in this?" The investigation turned inward, a painful purge. Several mid-level courtiers and one surprisingly senior communications aide were quietly isolated for questioning. The palace was a nest of whispers and fear. Under pressure, the communications aide broke. He revealed a meeting place, a private members' club in Mayfair, where Constance had met with a small group of wealthy backers, old money aristocrats, and a shadowy tech billionaire with radical traditionalist views. They called themselves the Stewardship Group. Their goal was not to overthrow the monarchy, but to steer it back to what they saw as its powerful, uncompromising roots. George was their project. Constance was their instrument. Armed with this, the king authorized a covert raid on the club's archives. While the media circus raged outside the palace gates, digital forensic specialists extracted data. They found plans, not for kidnapping, but for influence. A proposed independent educational board to oversee George's schooling, stacked with Constance's allies. A media strategy to slowly paint the king and queen as well-meaning but unfit guardians of the heir's royal destiny. It was a soft coup, a battle for the soul of a child waged through paperwork and propaganda. But Eris remained uneasy. "It's too clean," he argued to the team. "Constance is a psychologist. She deals in the mind. The journal, The final entry. A public test. This media leak is nasty, but it's a test of the system, not of George. The test is still coming. And he's at his most vulnerable in the clinic. His warning was heeded. Security at the London clinic was doubled and made invisible. Plainclothes officers posed as orderlies and visitors. Every delivery, every staff member was vetted again. They were waiting. They didn't have to wait long. A woman, her face altered by a realistic silicone prosthesis and a brunette wig, presented credentials as a specialist pediatric psychiatrist, Dr. Evangeline Frost, summoned for a second opinion. The credentials were flawless forgeries, and she matched the physical description of a known associate of the stewardship group. She was allowed through the outer cordon but stopped at the prince's private suite door by an orderly, Eris Thorne. "I need to assess the prince," the woman said, her voice calm, but her eyes, behind stylish glasses, held a familiar, calculating coldness. It was Constance. "Of course, doctor," Eris said, not blinking. "Right this way." He led her not into George's room, but into a side room where the king, the queen, and 4 armed protection officers stood waiting. Constance stopped. For the first time, a crack appeared in her composure. It wasn't fear, but disdain. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice shedding its false warmth. "You are interrupting a critical therapeutic intervention. The only intervention here," Queen Catherine said, stepping forward, "is your arrest." Her voice trembled, not with weakness, but with controlled fury. "You will never go near my son again." Constance looked at them all, a sad smile on her false face. "You think this is over? You think locking me away saves him? The seed is planted. The doubt is in his mind. The conflict between your bleeding heart love and the cold purity of duty. That is the fracture I made. And fractures, your majesties, have a way of growing." Her gaze swept over them, finally landing on Eris. "And you? The loyal watchdog. You saved the body. But who will save his mind from the prison of your sentimental world?" She offered her wrists for the handcuffs, her mission, in her eyes, already a partial success. The silent ride from the London clinic to a high-security government facility was a study in contrasts. Inside the armored vehicle, Lady Constance Havisham sat with her back straight, her altered face now stripped of its prosthetics, staring ahead with an unnerving serenity. Opposite her, Eris Thorne and a senior detective watched. The detective seethed with the triumph of a capture. Eris felt only a cold, lingering dread. Constance's final words were not the rantings of a defeated fanatic. They were a diagnosis. She had, indeed, planted a seed. At the palace, the immediate crisis was contained, but the aftermath was a landscape of wreckage. The stewardship group was being dismantled, its members facing charges of conspiracy, fraud, and breaches of national security. The king addressed the nation in a live, unprecedented broadcast. His face was lined with a parent's pain and a monarch's resolve. He confirmed a malign influence had been removed from the prince's circle, praised the exceptional loyalty and perception of a member of his guard, though he didn't name Eris, and asked for privacy and understanding as his family healed. It was a masterful performance of vulnerability and strength, meant to draw a line under the scandal. But in the private quarters, no line could be drawn. Prince George was brought home to the familiar surroundings of his apartment at Kensington. He was physically safe, but psychologically adrift. The journal was gone. His tutor was gone. The rigid, terrifying structure of his life had collapsed, but so had his sense of reality. He was quiet, polite, and utterly detached. He would answer questions in a monotone. He would flinch if his mother moved to hug him too quickly. Queen Catherine, guided by the now openly involved Dr. Anya Sharma, began the long, gentle process of deprogramming. It involved play therapy, rebuilding trust through simple, consistent affection, and allowing George to express confusion and anger. One afternoon, while building a sprawling Lego castle, George looked at his mother and asked, "Is it wrong that I miss the lessons sometimes?" She said they were making me strong. Catherine's heart broke anew. "Oh, my love, there are many kinds of strength. The strength to be kind is harder than the strength to be cold. The strength to ask for help is greater than the strength to suffer alone. She taught you a lie." George absorbed this, his small fingers clicking a Lego brick into place. "Corporal Thorne screamed," he said quietly. "He was scared for me." "Yes," Catherine said. "He saw you and others, even Mummy and Daddy, were not looking closely enough. He is a good man." Weeks turned into a month. Eris Thorne was formally reinstated, offered a promotion and a medal. He declined the promotion, requesting instead a permanent post as part of Prince George's close protection team. The request was granted. He understood the enemy's tactics now, and he understood the battlefield, the boy's mind. His presence was no longer just about physical security. It was a steady, silent reminder of the day someone had fought for him, not just for the prince. One crisp autumn day, Eris was on duty in the palace gardens. George was kicking a football listlessly against the garden wall. The king and queen watched from a terrace, their arms linked, their faces still shadowed but hopeful. George stopped kicking the ball. He walked over to Eris, looking up at him. The sunglasses were gone. Eris made sure George could always see his eyes. Corporal Thorne? Yes, your highness. When you shouted, you said, she made you do it. What did you mean? Eris knelt, bringing himself to the boy's level. This was the question he dreaded and hoped for. The truth was the only tool left. I meant that seeing you so hurt, so scared, made me feel an anger so big it had to come out. I couldn't stop it. She didn't make me scream, George. What she was doing to you did. My heart made me do it. Because sometimes, when something is very, very wrong, silence is the real enemy. George considered this, his brow furrowed in a way that was so endearingly, ordinarily childlike. She said silence was strength. She was wrong about almost everything, Eris said softly. Especially that. George nodded, a slow, thoughtful gesture. Then, he did something he hadn't done since before the garden party. He reached out and took Eris's hand, his small fingers curling around the guard's calloused ones. It wasn't a royal gesture. It was a human one. Thank you, he whispered. On the terrace, Catherine let out a soft breath, leaning into her husband. It wasn't a cure. It was a single, fragile stitch in a deep wound. The road to healing would be long, marked by setbacks and night terrors. The specter of Constance Havisham and her ideology would linger in the halls of power, a warning of how easily tradition could curdle into tyranny. But in that sun-dappled garden, a guard and a prince stood hand in hand. The scream that had shattered a perfect day had ended in a silence that was not empty, but full of a hard-won understanding. The battle for a child's soul was not won in a dramatic raid or a king's speech. It was won in quiet moments of truth, in the choice to reach out, and in the relentless, ordinary courage of those who refused to look away. The monarchy would endure, but it would be forever changed, scarred by the knowledge that its greatest fortress was not stone walls or loyal soldiers, but the vulnerable, human heart of the boy who would one day be king.